Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and let's continue on with our lecture series. Today, we're going to talk about World War One, or as people like to colloquially call it in history, the Great War, or as Woodrow Wilson called it, the war to end all wars. Before I get started here, I do want to let you know that remember, it is your responsibility if these lectures are posted. Let's say you miss a lecture. Let's say you're absent that day, or you're sick, or you're doing whatever. Uh, it's your responsibility to go back and watch these lectures and make sure that your knowledge base is up to par because we will not delay. I will not repeat lectures. And what I advise you to do is grab the lecture notes and take notes while you are listening because retention is very important and you are doubling your retention factor. You're actually tripling your retention factor by watching the lecture, listening to the lecture, and of course, taking notes. You're increasing and aiding your factor in retention. So, with that being said, without further ado, let's go ahead and get rocking. And we'll go from the beginning. The Great War, or as Woodrow Wilson liked to call it, the war to end all wars, because this is the first modern war. It's a new war for a new century. And this is a war that would bring about the advent of new technologies. But it would also, being a new war for a new century, would also look a lot like other wars because it evolves into hell. It evolves into man's inhumanity to man. But I'm a little cheeky here in my title. I call it the Great War, and I've always found that title to be somewhat silly because it sort of sparks of hubris, the hubris of every generation. Because I mean, whoever plans a war doesn't want it to be great. It's like, okay, let's just have an okay war and get it over with. No, you want it to be great because it is a cause, and there was always the cause. All right, so if we're going to talk specifically about World War One, going to get into it. You can characterize the foundation of World War One and the problems that it evokes under the mnemonic MAIN. And if we're going to start that off right, we're going to talk first about militarism for the M. And militarism is at this point in history is defined on the part of many countries to build up their military strength to scare other countries from attacking them. And this leads other nearby countries to start building up their militaries. Case in point, Germany. Germany develops the Bismarck, which is a huge, ultra modern, pretty scary battleship. And this alarms Great Britain. And the Bismarck, and of course the buildup of their army, the militaristic bent of early 20th century Germany is a cause for great alarm, which causes Great Britain to start arming. This in turn causes France to start arming. The intransigence of the Austro Hungarian Empire towards their Serbian minority in the Czechoslovakian region. This causes Russia to start arming and threatening and saber rattling. And so it's like a series of dominoes that start to fall. If you line up dominoes in a line and you tip one over, one will start to keep falling right after the other until all have fallen. And this is what you see occurring. Now, the causes of war. The next section under the A would be alliance systems. And this is where you have, and this is also a factor involved in the cause of World War One. This is where you have all of these old world monarchies, these old world empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire. All of these latent 18th and 19th century empires, they are on their last gasp. as such, because times are evolving, they sign mutual defense treaties with each other in order to discourage the attack of another empire upon not only its territory in Europe but its territorial possessions in Africa. And this, in turn, very similar to the dominoes that we just mentioned, this causes other alliances to start to fall into place. All right, and imperialism. As I said, this old monarchical order is starting to be challenged, and it's starting to fall, especially in places like Africa. You have earlier, prior to World War One, you have the Boer War in South Africa, where you have the Dutch fighting against the English, and this comes very close to becoming an early front in the First World War. And this is basically over territory, over imperial territory. And this is due in large part to the competition, the burgeoning industrial revolution. This is due in large part to the competition between these empires for wealth, for power, and for glory to their home country. In South Africa, you have a lot of gold, you have a lot of diamonds, and Europe saw that and saw that as a proper battleground to establish dominance in Africa. The European powers did. But this imperial rivalry eventually leads different countries to become increasingly hostile to one another. The Dutch and the English, in turn, the Germans see what's going on with them, and they become hostile to English intentions in Europe and start to build up their military. This, in turn, leads to Great Britain building up their military. Belgium is considered a red line in Europe. Belgium, very small country in Europe, but very much under the influence and sway of Great Britain. And they see Belgium as a red line. If Germany invades Belgium, they have a non-aggression pact with Belgium, which also has a caveat which would lead them to war if Germany attacks them. And this is due in large part to their imperialistic designs. Okay, the last one is nationalism. Now, nationalism gets a bit of a bum rap, I think. Nationalism is often associated with a term called jingoism. 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 And what I'm going to do, I'm not going to pause the lecture, but if you want, you can hit pause right now. And what I'd actually like you to do is look up the term jingoism and read it for yourself. And I will reconvene in 3, 2, 1. Nationalism is basically pride in one's nation. And like I said, this isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. But in the pre-World War One days, nationalistic fervor was at a high. People were proud to be German. People were proud to be British. People were proud to be French. And what this would naturally do is pit one nation against the other. You see this in America after certain conflicts, after World War II, especially, but more on that later. You see this nationalistic fervor that leads America eventually to think that it is the premier police force and premier governing country system in the world. Well, all of these individual empires saw themselves as that prior to the start of hostilities. And you have to also remember that many nations existed in Europe at this point in time that did not have independence, and they were controlled by these larger empires. So there, if you like, for example, Serbia, there was a tremendous amount of nationalistic bent. They wanted independence from Austro-Hungary, and they were willing to do whatever they could do to, in essence, get that independence. And this occurs with this event right here, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Now, I believe that had this guy never been assassinated, he would have faded into history and you never would have known of him because he was a fairly unremarkable guy. He was also remarkably naive, as we're going to talk about here in a minute. Um, but he's one of those characters in history that matters because he is literally the spark that sets the fuse to light that ignites World War One. Now, when I was a kid, I used to stay up late with my dad on Friday and Saturday night. We used to watch these old spaghetti westerns, and if you could imagine one of these old, Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns where you have this, bow, wow, wow. There's invariably a scene in these westerns where somebody takes a big, huge barrel of gunpowder, and they take and cut an opening into the gunpowder, and they want to set up an explosion. So they cut an opening into the barrel and they pour the gunpowder. They start pouring the gunpowder from the barrel all the way from, let's say, 150, 200 feet away. And then they take what's left in the barrel and they put the barrel in either a building or on a wagon or in a cave. And then when they get, 150 yards away, Clint Eastwood, take a cigar and light the stream of gunpowder, the fuse, and it would spark and it would start burning, and you would see it burn all the way along the yard line, all the yards away, and it would hit the barrel and explode. And this is what the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand actually does. A little bit of background. June 27th, 1914, in Sarajevo, the Archduke and his wife are in a motorcade and they are reviewing the crowd and waving. Someone throws a grenade or a bomb of some sort at his car. Well, it misses and it hits the car behind him, blows up. They get him out of there. He and his wife are okay on the 27th. And he's pretty furious. He's angered that there's not a lack of security. But the mayor of Sarajevo says, "Oh, Archduke, it's we're sorry, but we've taken necessary precautions and we're rounding up the usual suspects, and we're sure that everything is okay and that there's not going to be an issue." Well, the next day, on the 28th, he wants to visit the people that were injured in the attack the day before with the bomb. So he demands to go to the hospital and pay his respects and visit the injured parties. And his driver sets out the next morning. They load up in the limousine, the open air limousine, and they set about to go to the hospital. However, on the way to the hospital, the driver makes a wrong turn. And eventually, a young gentleman named Gavrilo Princip, who is a Serbian nationalist. He is sitting in a cafe as the car of the Archduke turns right in front of him. Now he notices the Archduke and he was a little distraught because the day prior, he and his compatriots were the ones that threw the bomb at the Archduke's limousine and it missed. At this point, he's amazed at his good fortune because he sees them turn right in front of him down a street that dead ends. And that is an appropriate metaphor because they turn into a dead end. Well, let me quit talking and show you how Hollywood recently portrayed it.
I knew this was the wrong way. I mean, the next left.
Stop arguing. We're sitting ducks here. Get this car moving now.
And of course, the proverbial blank hits the fan. I won't use the expletive, but the fuse that was lit, the fuse is now lit, and the fuse is starting to burn towards the powder keg. June 28th, the Archduke is shot along with his wife. 1 month later, Austria Hungary declares war on Serbia because it is clear that Serbian nationalists were behind it. So they declare war on Serbia and pledge to root out this cancer from the Austro Hungarian Empire. Well, Russia, who is allied with the Serbian Nationalist Front, they in turn declare war on Austria Hungary on July 31st. On August 1st, Germany, reacting towards this move by Russia, declares war on Russia, and also France, who have signed a non aggression pact and a pact of cooperation with France and Russia. They in turn declare war on both Russia and France. 3 days later, Germany invades Belgium, which causes Great Britain to go to war with Germany. If you remember the country of Belgium, Great Britain saw that as a red line that would pull them into the conflict. So, very quickly, two sides developed the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy also, and later, much later, Japan and America would eventually come into play, but not yet. And the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Austro-Hungary, or Austria-Hungary, the Austria-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, they said initially that it would be over by Christmas, that, the might of the Allied powers would mop this up in no short order, and it would be over. They were unfortunately dreadfully wrong. And what happens is that the war very quickly, and you have to understand something, this was a new war, but it was fought under old war rules. And this would change when America comes into the conflict, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But this is a modern war fought under old war rules. And it very quickly devolves into a war of attrition. Now, attrition is another one of those words that I want you to pause and look up. Attrition, attrition. And I'm going to pause, give you a chance to stop the recording, and I will reconvene in 3, 2, 1. Attrition. Eventually, it becomes not a war with an objective, or not a war with an overarching objective over territory, but a war that basically says, okay, yards, feet, inches, miles, and it's a war that evolves into trench warfare, where trenches are dug to hold territory. People get out of the trenches, they charge, they take a mile or two a day, or 50 yards a day, and then there's a counterattack. They have to get out of the trenches, they have to run back, and it's a war that eventually evolves into a stalemate. And here is another film clip from the film 1917. Should give you, I think, a very good idea of what it was like. I'm going to have you watch this, and I'm going to walk away for a minute. I'll be right back.
Stay low.
I've got to say, careful there. You're stepping on the dead. And that's our sergeant. We'd better washing him out of this dugout with a bloody hose.
Do you know where the Yorks are?
Our next band will be standing on top of half of them. Shot to hell 2 nights ago.
Yorks?
Yes, Corporal.
Where's Major Stevenson?
I was killed a couple of nights ago, Corporal. Lieutenant Leslie has come on.
Where can we find him? Next dugout.
Here.
Sir? Lieutenant Leslie, sir.
What is it?
We have a message from General Erinmore.
That you are relieved?
No, sir.
When the fucking hell are they due?
We don't know, sir, but we've got orders to cross here.
That is the German front line.
We know, sir. If you'll just take the letter.
Settle a bet. What day is it?
Friday.
Friday. Well. None of us was right. This idiot thought it was Tuesday.
Sorry, sir.
Are they out of their fucking minds? One slow night, the brass think the Hun have just gone home.
Do you think they're wrong, sir?
We lost an officer and 3 men 2 nights ago. They were shot to bits patching up wire. We dragged 2 of them back here. Needn't bother.
Sir, the General is sure the enemy have withdrawn. There are aerials of the new line that
Shut up. We fought and died over every inch of this fucking place. Now they suddenly give us miles. It's a trap. But tune up. There's a medal in it, for sure. Nothing like a scrap of ribbon to cheer up a widow. All right.
Where's the nearest way through, sir?
Our wire's a mess, but there is a path through of sorts. Rushworth, let him look. Straight ahead to the left, past the dead horses. There's a gap directly behind them. Useful, because if it's dark, you follow the stench. When you get to the second wire, look out for the bowing chaps. There's a small break just beside him. The German line is 150 odd yards after that. Watch out for the craters. They're deeper than they look. You fall in, there's no getting out. This way. Wake up, Kilgore. Bloody waste of space.
Any cover, sir? Any way to jump off?
No, the sap trench was blown to hell weeks ago. It was full of bodies anyway. Your best bet is to pop over here. If you do get shot, try to make it back to the wire. We won't come after you, not till it's dark. And if by some fucking miracle you do make it, send up a flare.
Don't have any, sir.
Well, get him one, Kilgore. Make yourself useful.
Yes, sir.
Through this holy unction, may the Lord pardon you your faults and whatever sins thou hast committed. I do hate losing these to the Hun, so when they start shooting at you, could you be so kind as to throw it back? There's a good chap. Cheerio.
You sure? Yes. Age before beauty.
Okay, if there is ever, I think, an appropriate description of war, I think it is the war that you see that occurs in World War One, the trench warfare. Trenches full of bodies, trenches full of disease and vermin and pestilence. Uh, Men who were disheveled, discouraged, who were clearly beaten down. A meat grinder, if you will, of I think, epic sociological proportions where people on both sides are put into this meat grinder and ground up and hamburger comes out. The effects of this war would be felt, or still felt, in Europe to this day. I've been to Verdun, France, which is in the sort of middle land between Germany and France. And I've been to Verdun. It's a very important city where a large battle was fought. And I've seen the remnants of the trenches, and there are people that are still buried in the trenches. An explosion would hit, and walls would cave in and bury people alive. And you can walk in Verdun, and they tell you to stay on the path as you're walking through the battlefield, because if you walk on the path, A, you're walking on the dead, but B, the tips of some of their bayonets are sticking out of the ground. And if you walk, you will walk on a bayonet or an explosive. They still dig explosives out of Verdun every day, even now today, because what they did, they basically went in and you have to understand, so many people died, and a lot of times people weren't identified. So they constructed what they call an ossuary, bones that they found. There was no way to identify people, but they basically just took the bones, collected them, put them in a giant memorial to the futility of war at Verdun, and they call it the ossuary. But let us move on. Come on. All right. So let's talk about the role of the U.S. in World War One. And if we're going to describe it initially, the role of the U.S. basically is isolationism. If you remember, the U.S. didn't want any part of what they saw as a European problem, and that's what they see Europe as, a European issue, European problem. Many in the United States did not believe that we had a good reason to be involved in that devastation of World War One that I just described. And there's a reason for that, and that basically is because the U.S. is a nation of immigrants. We have people that are native to countries on both sides of the conflict. We have people who are Austro-Hungarian, who are Russian, who are English, who are German, who are French. And so whose side basically are we going to take? And Wilson, I think it's really hard to say. I think Wilson, historically, if you read it in an objective fashion, I think Wilson did not want to get involved in World War One. I think Wilson wanted to stay out of it, primarily because he was a progressive president, and he wanted to continue with his progressive ideology of reforming American society. And he felt that the war would distract him from that. But eventually, we start to lean towards the Allied cause. And we start to move away from neutrality. And there are a couple of things that occur that cause us to inch further and further towards not only the Allied side, but entering the war on the side of the Allied powers. One of those major concerns, you have democracies, legitimate democracies, representative democracies like France and Great Britain, that start to fall to autocracies. And I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Look up autocracy, as it says right here on the screen. And I'm going to give you a little bit. You can pause the lecture and look up the word autocracy. I will reconvene in 3, 2, 1. But you have autocracies like Germany and the Ottoman Empire, for example, an autocracy that starts to exert itself. Both of these powers start to exert themselves on the European continent. And this concerns us because these, go back to militarism. This is very troubling because eventually we might get involved. There is also an event that occurs. There is a ferry boat named the Sussex, which is sunk in the English Channel by a German submarine. Now, submarine warfare is new to the world of war with World War One, and this is something that the militaries on both sides are having trouble digesting and dealing with. But one of the rules was that you would not sink a civilian vessel, and the Sussex is a civilian ferry that is sunk and people die. As such, we, as you have to understand, we want to remain neutral and stay out of the fight, and Germany actually wants us to remain neutral and stay out of the fight. They do not want us to enter in on the side of the Allied powers. And when they sink the Sussex, this creates a firestorm. And we threaten to pull our ambassador and pull diplomatic recognition from Germany over this issue. And so Germany comes out and pledges, hey, look, they do the Sussex pledge and say, okay, we're sorry. We apologize. Yeah, hey, it was bad. We're sorry. We apologize. We won't do it again. We'll give ample, excuse me, we'll give ample warning next time, and we won't do it again. Well, unfortunately, they two issues here. Great Britain dominates the seas. They have a far superior navy, followed closely by Germany. However, Germany has U-boats. But one of the things Great Britain does, they successfully control the flow of information from the U.S. to Germany, and they also are the arbiters of propaganda here in this conflict. And of course, Germany doesn't help themselves. They sink the Sussex, then they make the Sussex pledge that they won't sink any more civilian vessels, or I think one of the caveats in the Sussex pledge was that they would give ample warning to the vessels via radio and say, we need to board you and inspect you, or we're going to give you time to offload your passengers, and then we're going to sink your boat because we think you might be carrying munitions. Now, the Geneva Convention says that a civilian transport cannot carry wartime munitions. It's against the Geneva Convention because it would forego its legal neutrality and make it a legitimate target of war. And Germany sinks a civilian liner called the Lusitania on May 7th, 1915. It's sunk by a German submarine. It kills 1,100, almost 1,200 people, including Americans. One of the Vanderbilts, very famous American family, is on board the Lusitania, and he's one of the 1,200 people that are killed. Now, this act convinces the American public through yellow journalism and the sensationalism in the press that Germans are evil. They're evil. The Kaiser, the Hun, as the guy called him in the clip. They're evil, and this allows the press and Great Britain, who's controlling the propaganda, to put a black hat on people and say, "See, we told you. You need to join the war." And of course, the killing of 1,200 people is terrible. It's a war crime. But there's also another event that occurs in January of 1917 that is very suspicious, so to speak, in historical parlance. It's called the Zimmermann Telegram. And this is a communique that is intercepted by British intelligence, where the German government is contacting their ambassador in Mexico and encouraging him to parley with the Mexican government and get them to enter on the side of the Central Powers and open up a second front with America on the southern border of the United States. And what they say, if you start a war on the southern border of the United States and occupy America with a third front in the war, then what will occur is that if we win, you will get back Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. We'll give it back to you. And of course, Great Britain, once they intercept this, they gleefully translate it and bring it to the U.S. and say, we've got proof. They're trying to open up another front. Now, prudence would dictate with this sort of knowledge that the U.S. respond. And as such, what they do, let me pause this real quick because I've got to take this phone call, and I'll be back with you in a moment. Okay, I am back. That was a phone call that I had to take. Please forgive me. I do so apologize, but nonetheless, we are back and we're rocking and rolling. So, Zimmermann Telegram. As I said, Germany is trying to get Mexico to enter into the Central Pact and to attack the U.S. on its southern border. Prudence dictates that we respond. This ramps up the political pressure, both publicly and government wise, to get involved in the war. But first off, in order to secure our traditionally porous border with Mexico, we in turn deploy in one of the largest deployments ever. We deploy the National Guard to the southern border, and we call up people like my grandfather, who did not fight in World War One because he was a National Guardsman in Oklahoma, but he was called up at this point as a young man who was working on his parents' farm in Oklahoma. He was called up, and what's interesting is that my grandfather's name was von Weininger, which is a German name, a very interesting German name. And so my mother's family dropped the von, okay, and they just called themselves Weiningers. And my grandfather was born here in America, but his parents had very thick German accents, and German was spoken in their home. But he was part of the U.S. National Guard, so he was activated and called up and sent to the southern border in response. And America does get involved in Veracruz in Mexico, because if you remember from our last lecture, if you remember Blackjack Pershing, Wilson sends Pershing into Mexico to hunt down Pancho Villa. Uh, and Pershing and Pancho Villa were friends. And I don't think that Pershing really wanted that assignment. He was a good soldier, so he obeyed orders. But I don't think he liked hunting his friend. And I think even though he followed orders and came pretty close to capturing Villa a couple of times, he wasn't comfortable with the actual mission. He did follow through with it, but he was unsuccessful in capturing Villa. But the point that I want to make with the Mexican government at this point in time is that there is a certain amount of instability because Mexico is going through a revolution at this period in history. And so this is adding to the stress and adding to the political pressure to get involved and wrap this thing up. Now, before we go any further, let's take a look and give a listen here to a very brief story about the Lusitania. And if you remember, this was a civilian liner. It was allegedly carrying munitions. Now, of course, our side, or the British, deny that it was carrying munitions. But I want you to just give a listen here and then think about that after you watch this.
Before air travel, the departure of a great liner was considered news, and Cunard's Lusitania was the greatest, the fastest, the most luxurious liner afloat on May 1st, 1915, as she prepared to leave New York City for Liverpool. It was news that the glamorous and rich Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt was aboard, a member of the Just Missed It Club, people who had booked on the Titanic but canceled at the last minute. And it was news that in the morning papers that day, Germany, at war with Great Britain, published a warning that vessels flying the British flag or the flag of any of her allies were subject to attack as they passed through the waters off the British Isles.
Even though it made no mention of the Lusitania, it was widely interpreted to be aimed at the ship.
Eric Larson is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Dead Wake, about the Lusitania.
The prevailing view was that the Lusitania was too big, too fast to ever be caught by a German submarine. And also there was this other idea that no German commander would try to sink it in the first place because it was a passenger liner.
But on May 7th at 2:10 p.m., in sight of the Irish coast, the Lusitania was struck by a German torpedo. Moments later, there was a second explosion. She sank in just 18 minutes. 1,198 of the nearly 2,000 people on the ship died, more than 120 of them Americans.
Yeah, you can see there she is rising in again now.
Yeah.
And we've just come up over the wreck and we're about to cross down to the other side now.
The wreck is still down there in 300 feet of water. Boat Captain Carol O'Donoghue feels its presence.
You said you'd remember the tragedy of it all, really. Perfectly clear day, just like today.
Do you see nothing? Just water.
All I could see was heads bobbing up and down.
For a 1994 documentary, National Geographic interviewed survivors of the Lusitania.
And it was like a half a circle of people moaning in the water. It was just a moan, constant moan, and it gradually got less and less.
Owen McGarry has dived the wreck nearly 50 times. When you're out here, do you have feelings for what happened and what's down there?
When I look up at the surface, I can see bodies raining down. You can see what it was like. You can hear the screams.
The torpedo hit just behind the bridge on the starboard side. The ship tilted so far, so fast, only 6 lifeboats successfully made it into the water. Naval vessels in the area were ordered not to go near the site for fear they would be torpedoed too. So small boats made their way from Queenstown, now called Cove, 31 miles away. Some rescuers had to row the entire distance.
My grandfather raced down to the office, was immediately involved in the rescue operation, getting anybody who had a boat to go out.
Courtney Murphy's grandfather, Jerome Murphy, the Cunard Line manager in Queenstown, took charge.
He had to organize to commandeer rooms in the hotels where the survivors could be put up.
In this family photo, the small boy in the front row is Courtney Murphy's father, who watched as the rescue boats returned.
The bodies, as they came in the boats, would have been in whatever clothes they had on them, and then they were covered in shrouds or in sheets.
So your father remembered seeing
He remembered
bodies.
seeing lines of bodies being laid out here along the footpath, and that has an indelible memory for him.
There were 764 survivors. Among the dead, Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt. Today in Cove, there is a monument along the route the funeral procession took to the town cemetery, where the Lusitania dead were buried in mass graves. Mourners, as far as the eye could see, paying their respects. The pictures then and now, an eerie matchup. Was the sinking of the Lusitania just bad luck or something more sinister? Her captain, William Thomas Turner, believed she would have a British naval escort into port. None appeared. The British Navy didn't tell Captain Turner that U-20, the submarine that sunk her, was out there, something it knew because Germany's code books had been captured and then decoded at a top-secret facility called Room 40.
One explanation is that Room 40 was absolutely top secret, and by God, they were going to keep it that way. But another explanation is that it would not hurt the British effort if the Lusitania were sunk and Americans were killed, because it might draw America into the war.
Mm-hmm.
Winston Churchill oversaw Room 40. Head of the British Navy then, he was on record hoping for an incident that would drag the United States into the war.
There's no smoking memo, if you will, that says that Churchill or the Admiralty deliberately put the Lusitania in harm's way. There is, however, a body of evidence that if you look at it, it is really damning.
No one has ever been able to inspect the underside of the wreck, where the answer to the question, what caused the second explosion, may lie.
These 2 items were recovered in 2011.
The Irish government has only allowed diver Owen McGarry to bring up artifacts that were lying on the sea floor or were in the bridge area.
This is a multi-beam image of the wreck. It's a sonar beam that's sent from a ship that bounces off the sea floor. You could imagine the whole ship is lying on her side. The starboard side is underneath all that. And sadly, because she's lying on the torpedo wound, we can't see exactly. This is where all the carnage happened, where the torpedo strike and the second explosion.
McGarry, for one, doesn't believe the accepted conclusion that the second explosion was caused by the rupture of the ship's main steam line. She was carrying small arms munitions, but were there other explosives aboard?
I still think that there was, and she was carrying contraband. Something substantial caused that second explosion. And I do believe that there is somebody out there who does know.
Or not. The Lusitania remains fodder for conspiracy theorists.
It's the maritime grassy knoll. There are so many miraculous or nearly so things that happen that leaves room for people to say, well, that can't be it. I mean, here's this ship that sank in 18 minutes. It's just not possible, right?
100 years later, as time takes its toll, the truth only becomes more elusive.
Okay, very interesting. Hold on.
Before air...
There we go. Okay. So as a result of that interesting miscommunication or purposeful neglect on the part of the British, very interesting, to say the least. Winston Churchill, in charge of the Admiralty, the British Navy, he was basically the secretary of the British Navy. They knew their codes. They knew how to break their codes. He found out about the Zimmerman telegram and he trumpeted that. The Lusitania. It's clear that the objective of the British government was to get us involved. And as such, the U.S. declares war on April 6, 1917. As Wilson does not want to, but he does. And he calls it the war to end all wars. And as such, we're going to go directly into part two, the Great War, part two, over there and over here. So first, let's talk about over there. Now, the U.S. is initially unprepared for war when it's declared on April 2nd, 1917. Now, I find it interesting that we declare war on April 2nd. Of course, April 1st is April Fool's Day. And of course, they didn't want that image to be there. But so we wait till April 2nd and we declare war on April 2nd, 1917. We have about 200,000 soldiers with very few supplies. And as such, we deploy them directly to the Western Front, which is, from what we've seen in our movie clips, a stalemate of just interscene and attrited trench warfare. Now, there are some technological innovations. You have the development of the machine gun. This is a new weapon. You have barbed wire, which is used fairly extensively to mark off lines. You have mines that are used for the first time in warfare on land. Advanced artillery, where you can actually plot and graph and send shells into the enemy if you know their position. Flamethrowers, you have the rudimentary flamethrowers that are used. And of course, if you look down at the picture below, those two soldiers are wearing gas masks. This is the first time where chemical warfare is used in a town called Ypres in France. They use what's called mustard gas, which is a blister agent, which when you breathe it, it causes burns in your trachea, in your lungs, swelling, and swelling, of course, produces fluid. And so it causes drowning. You pretty much drown on the fluid that's produced from the burns that you breathe in. Now, the Americans get involved in a new weapon or with a new weapon that is developed by us and by the Wright brothers. The airplane is, of course, invented by the Wright brothers. Now, here's the deal: the Wright brothers did not necessarily invent the airplane. Airplanes were they had prototypes all throughout Europe. The French had one, the British had one, the Germans had one. Uh, but we were the ones that successfully made the airplane fly. We were the first people to successfully launch an airplane, and that was the Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And eventually, what happens is that the value of the airplane as an instrument of war for reconnaissance is used. It's seen immediately, right away. Now, when I was in the military, I used to work with a man named Chuck Yeager, General Chuck Yeager, who was an American hero, great guy. And he told me a story once about World War One, and told me a story about the development of the airplane. And he said that initially, when the airplane was developed, that both sides developed airframes, and they would use them for spotting. They would use them for intelligence purposes. They would fly up, go way high, and then they would look down and they would have a map and they would say, okay, the British are here, the Germans are here, and they would cross paths as they were flying in the sky. General Yeager said that they was very cordial. They would look and wave at each other as they were flying to go do their duty. And he said everything was fine until some bastard pulled out a gun and took a shot, and then the airplane became a weapon of war. And this is where the U.S. gets involved. Eventually, the new machine gun with a synchronized propeller, with a synchronization, gear synchronization. The machine gun is used on the airframes, and they become weapons of war almost overnight. They also use them to drop bombs. Here's an example of how they were used, and I'll just quit talking and play the clip here. So, come on. Hello. Hello. Come on. Okay, here we go. Okay, now as a 33-year Air Force veteran, my question to that film clip, and by the way, I apologize about the initial problems there, but my question to that film clip is where the hell was his wingman when the German attacked him? You had three other guys there. Where the hell were they? Why is he left to take care of the problem on his own? But I digress. But anyway, nonetheless, the Americans become heavily involved, and not only on the ground but in the air with the Lafayette Escadrille, the squadron of Lafayette. If you remember Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette was a hero of the American Revolution. He was a Frenchman that came to fight with General Washington, and of course, General Pershing, in a very deft political move, I think, when American troops land on the French shore at Calais, and they're embarking from the ship. A reporter asks General Pershing, "Do you have anything to say, sir?" And Pershing walks up to the crowd of reporters, and there's about 150 Frenchmen or 200 Frenchmen who are watching the Americans disembark, and he says, "Lafayette, we are here." And the crowd applauds and erupts. Very great political moment. But eventually, the introduction of America into World War One is a very good thing because the Russians, if you remember, the Russian Revolution occurs, and the Russians actually pull out of World War One. They pull out of World War One, and they leave the Central or the Allied Powers Pact. So this leaves France, Belgium, and Italy in the lurch, and Japan in the lurch. They're not quite sure if they can survive without Russia's help. So America comes in right as the Russians are leaving, and they pick up the slack. And we bring fresh blood, fresh legs. We bring a new way of fighting. And instead of going into the trenches, we start out in the trenches, but General Pershing demands that American troops get out of the trenches and fight the Germans face to face. And we do that, our doughboys as they are called, we do that in Belleau Wood and at the Argonne Forest in the spring of 1918. But before that, we basically turn to the draft. We start calling up Americans through the draft, and we eventually mobilize about 4.5 million men, and 11,000 women would join the auxiliary, totaling basically 400,000 Americans, or African Americans as well, who would fight. As you noted, the gentleman that was flying the aircraft was African American, but about 400,000 African Americans would fight in World War One as well. And 2 million men experienced combat in France. Now, the U.S. Expeditionary Force is critical to helping the Allies leave or helping the Allies get the upper hand after Russia leaves in 1917. And General Pershing, one of the controversial things that he does, he demands once he gets there, because the French want to basically run the whole show. They want to be the ones that dictate and say, okay, you guys are going to go or fight here, you're going to occupy the trenches. And Pershing basically says no. Marshal Pétain is the French commander, and Pershing and Pétain don't really like each other because Pershing countermands his orders. Pershing says, I am in command of my own troops. I'll help you, but Americans are in charge of Americans. And as such, Pershing orders the Americans out of the trenches, and we meet the Germans head on at Belleau Wood and in the Argonne Forest. And in those spring offensives, we punch the Germans hard in the mouth, and we exacerbate their problem of not only supply, because they are running low on supplies. We start to really put a crimp in their war material and their men, and so they start to consider surrendering, and they argue for peace. Now, this is where you have heroes that come to the forefront. Eddie Rickenbacker in the Escadrille Americaine, or the Lafayette Escadrille Americaine. He is the first U.S. ace, which means he got 5 or more kills of Germans. And then you have Alvin York, who is a foot soldier who captures over 200 Germans and gets the Medal of Honor, the first American recipient of the Medal of Honor in World War I. So now let's talk about life at home. You have a total mobilization at this point of the civilian population to win the war. And as such, Wilson appoints a gentleman, George Creel, to head the Committee on Public Information. And this is interesting to me because if you look at some of these posters, these posters are works of art. They are very well done. They're propaganda posters, but they're remarkably well done. I like the one that my picture is covering up. Let me see if I can move it. Show you the full effect of this. Yeah, here we go. All right, so you see the destroy this mad brute, the beast, the wild-eyed gorilla with fangs who is clutching the beautiful woman and has a club in his hand. If you look at the club, it says Kultur by German, Kultur. So what kind of message is that sending? That's sending a message saying that our culture, the Germans think that they want to force their culture on us as Americans, and they're going to beat us with a club if we don't do something. And of course, the one right next to it, will you fight now or will you wait until they come here? It's nice in the surf, but what about the men in the trenches? Go and help, do your part. These were all very important parts of getting the civilian population mobilized to fight in the war. And of course, dissent is also at this point not tolerated at all. You have an Espionage and Sedition Act of 1917, which does have some effects. People start to become very concerned about people with German last names, namely my mother's family. Like I said, they dropped the von from their name. And Weininger, von Weininger from von Weininger to Weininger, because they were concerned about this. And of course, prejudice against Germans also went culture because the mad brute there is carrying his culture stick, right? Defeating culture. You have common foods that are used or that are eaten in America. You have schnitzel. You have schnitzel that is basically a steak that is fried, or steak that is made in gravy. That becomes Salisbury steak. Schnitzel becomes Salisbury steak. Bratwurst or Frankfurter becomes hot dogs. You have sauerkraut, Kraut, that becomes Liberty cabbage. So they rename foods because they don't want it to be associated with the German Hun. Of course, you also have rationing. You have meatless Mondays where people don't eat meat on Monday because you have to preserve the meat for the war effort. And the government starts to encourage people to have victory gardens, grow your own vegetables, because we want to save the mass-produced vegetables for the troops overseas. Now, I like to put this in here. This isn't on your notes, but it's something that I like to put in. I like to remember this whenever there is a lecture on war, because this is a poem by Lord Byron, who was a 19th century British poet. When a man hath no cause to fight for at home, let him battle for that of his neighbors, to think of the glories of Greece and of Rome, and get knocked on his head for his labors. To do good for all men is the obvious cause, and is always nobly requited. So battle for freedom wherever you can, and if not shot or hanged, you'll be knighted. Kind of the way soldiers thought of the war and their duty, and that's changed somewhat, sadly, I think, in the modern era, because the mission and the responsibility of Americans were very pronounced and very obvious during both of those World War conflicts. So, with that being said, we're going to move on to World War III, and we're going to work for peace. And this won't be long, we're almost done, so bear with me. So, casualties. If we look in the aftermath, look at who suffered the most here. You have Russia and Germany, who had just dramatic numbers. And these are guesstimates, by the way, because we didn't really keep really good records back then. We sort of guessed at who was where and where they died. So Russia, 1,700,000. Same with Germany. France comes in next. Then, of course, down the line, Austria. And then Great Britain and its empire, almost 1,000,000. Italy, slightly less than that. Romania, slightly less than that. Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. Then, of course, the USA at 126,000. And then so on and so on. Japan only lost about 300 men. Of course, their contribution to the war was very minuscule. Wounded, parallels very similar, although you have more wounded than you have, of course, dead, but you can see those figures for yourself. About 11 million total die in the war, and that would include a total of about 7 million civilians that die as well. If you're looking at expenditures, the U.S. spends about 22 billion. Over 100,000 Americans would die in the war. 126,000 total would die in the war. That's a bargain considering what Russia and Germany, and of course even Great Britain, had to experience. Entire generations were affected in Europe for years to come. None more so than in Germany. And I'm not taking Germany's side here, but I used to live in Germany, and I used to, on the weekends, I would ride my bicycle and go to these little small hamlets and villages all throughout Germany. And in every small village and hamlet in Germany, there is, in the center of the town, a statue of a soldier. And there, underneath that statue of the World War I soldier, there are names. Every village in Germany lost young men to that war. No village is immune. So it was very much a scar upon Europe, and it remains so to this day. So let's talk about Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. In the aftermath of the war, Wilson, who has a great deal of political clout, Wilson decides that he has a plan for the peace. And he develops his plan, and he says that it is a 14-point plan. And if we follow this plan, we can guarantee that there will be peace for decades, because this is the war to end all wars, right? Well, the first point, open diplomacy. Number 2, freedom of the seas. The removal of economic barriers. Okay, those two there, freedom of the seas, removal of economic barriers, directly related to trade. You have the reduction of armaments. He thinks that we should get away from militarism. The adjustment of colonial claims. He believes that we should look at the claims of countries like Serbia, for example, and we should redraw the map of Europe and give these countries their independence. He wants a preservation of Belgian sovereignty. He wants Belgium to become a sovereign and protected nation. He wants the restoration of French territory, the redrawing of Italian borders, because Austria-Hungary took certain portions of Italy and melded it into their empire. He wants, and subsequent to that, he wants a division of Austria-Hungary, and he wants to redraw the Balkans, where this whole thing started, the Balkanization of Europe, Serbia, Montenegro, the Czech Republic. He wants to redraw those boundaries, give certain people independence, to where you basically take the powder keg away from the fuse and where this won't happen again. He also wants limitations on Turkey because the Ottoman Empire not only controls the country of Turkey and that peninsula there, they control the Middle East at this point. They control Saudi Arabia, for example, and the Levant. And of course, now that they have discovered oil in the Middle East, this is a very important thing to look at. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement will redraw the borders and boundaries of the Middle East. And what you see now today, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, places like that, these are countries that were made in the post-war period. He wants the establishment of an independent Poland, which used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He wants them to be free and independent. And then he wants the 14th point, he wants the creation of an association of nations. He calls it a League of Nations, where we can get together and talk and work out our differences. And he feels that if we're able to do this, that we can avoid war and not go back to what we had prior, which was, if you remember, by our mnemonic, Maine. Now, Wilson, he urges, because of the U.S.'s key role in winning the war, he basically urges that they adopt these plans. He also urges that we go light on Germany. And France, Great Britain, Italy, they want to punish Germany because they see that Germany is the reason why so many people died in this war. They see Germany as the cause. But Wilson says if we go light on Germany, that we can keep war from occurring again. So this is Wilson basically taking his progressivism and applying it to international relations here, international politics. And basically, overall, what Wilson is advocating for is a respect for national self-determination. And of course, the 14th point, the mediation body, the League of Nations, just ask you a question. What would that eventually become? What would that be the model for? For those of you that said the United Nations, you are correct. That was the idea. Now, European powers, they don't want any part of this. As a matter of fact, Clemenceau, George Clemenceau, who is the French president, he turns to Lloyd George, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he says, Monsieur Wilson brings his 14 points to the table. Did not God himself have only 10? Who does Wilson think he is? So there's some reluctance, outright hostility towards Woodrow Wilson and these 14 points. And they don't want any part of this. Like I said, they want to punish Germany. And Wilson advocates, not directly for Germany, but he does advocate for not going down this path of retribution because he, I think, can wisely see that it will lead to another conflict and to eventual war. So the Treaty of Versailles is set. They wanted revenge. The European leaders wanted revenge, and they got it. They saddled Germany with a remarkable amount of debt and reparations. They also required Germany to reduce their army, to give up territory, to give up their colonial possessions in Africa, and basically admit that they were guilty for the cost of the war and that they caused it. Now, the only proposal that they approve of is the League of Nations. They look at Wilson's 14 points, reject 13, and they basically say, okay, we'll go with the League of Nations. We'll give you that bone. And Wilson's not happy about this because he's rejected in Europe. He's frustrated that he only got them to agree to the League of Nations. So he returns to the United States because you have the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, and in America, Congress and or both houses of Congress, or the Senate actually, the Senate has to ratify the treaty. It has to go through the Senate, and then approval is granted for the president to sign it. It's part of our checks and balances system. But the Republican Senate, which is led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, he opposes the treaty, arguing that being in the League of Nations would tie the U.S. too strongly to the rest of the world. And now you could interpret or you could intuit looking at this that this also was perhaps a cause of World War II, or perhaps Lodge was thinking if we get involved in European politics or the post war European melee of sorting out blame for the war, that we could be potentially dragged back into another conflict. But he felt that what would happen is that the League of Nations would tie America too strongly to the rest of the world. And one of the things that we did not want to do is go back into an internationalist role. Many in the U.S. thought that World War I had hurt us and that we'd gotten nothing in return because of Wilson's rejection in Europe. And so the only default was to take our ball and go home and opt for isolationism. And that's basically what we do. So Wilson tirelessly works to get the treaty approved. He is overworked, he's overstressed, he suffers a debilitating stroke because of this, and he could not campaign anymore. As such, the U.S. Senate votes not to sign the treaty, not to ratify it, and they stay out of the League of Nations. The League of Nations is formed without U.S. help. It's formed as an international body, but the Senate demands, the U.S. government demands that we stay out of it, and as such, it's ineffective without U.S. participation. So, in summary, what were the causes of World War I? Very good. Main: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. What events lead to the U.S. entering the war? Sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann Telegraph, and of course Germany's violation of the Sussex Pledge. What was the only one of Woodrow Wilson's points to survive the Treaty of Versailles? The League of Nations. Very good. Did the European nations want peace with Germany? Yes or no? No, of course not. They wanted Germany to pay. They wanted revenge, hence the draconian sanctions. So here's a real question for those historians in our midst, or budding proto-historians. What would these sanctions eventually lead to? Worldwide Great Depression and World War II. And that is the end. We will come back here next up with the Roaring '20s, and I will see you then. Thank you so much for your rapt attention. And that is all for now. Thanks a lot, guys. See you soon.